So it's been about 1 week since the Silent Hill 2 remake was released to us, and my god, it has taken over my entire life. I reviewed the game the day it launched in early access. It was my first impressions review, but since then, I've fully beaten the game. I've spent a lot of time with it. I've been obsessed with it. I haven't stopped talking about it to anyone around me that'll listen, which of course means I have a lot more thoughts I want to share with you guys. So consider this to be my full review of the Silent Hill 2 remake. But I'm going to give you guys a spoiler warning right now. After sitting on this game and thinking about it and letting it really sink in, I think this might be a perfect survival horror game. Definitely one of the best, if not the best survival horror game that we've gotten in years. Many, many years. Maybe even over a decade. Maybe even over 2 decades. From the pacing, to the gameplay, to the story and the narrative, there's just so much this game does right. It's been hard for me to even look at another video game ever since I started this one. But anyway, in this video, I want to go over some of the core reasons of why I think so highly of this game. I'm gonna review it for you guys. I'm gonna show you guys some raw gameplay. But before I do that, consider hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you're new here, I talk about video games all the time on this channel. I do day one reviews all the time, and horror games always get special treatment on this channel. But anyways, I'm gonna keep this intro short because I have a lot to talk about. So without further ado, let's talk about the Silent Hill 2 remake. So an important warning first, this video will contain spoilers for most of the game, so just keep that in mind. But with that being said, the first thing I want to talk about specifically is the pacing and level design of the game, and how it's undoubtedly one of the best I've ever experienced. Survival horror is my favorite genre of gaming, no doubt. No questions asked. If I were to make a definitive list of my top 10 video games of all time, over half of them would be in the realm of horror, most likely. But with that being said, there's a problem that plagues so many survival horror games, and that's how there's often a mid to late game slog, a certain part of the game that just fails to live up to everything else around it. I know you can say that about almost every and any video game in any genre, but in my experience, those moments are showcased tenfold in horror games, mainly due to the slower pacing. For example, Resident Evil 4 is notorious for this. It's one of the biggest offenders in a lot of people's eyes. So many people love the opening village in Resident Evil 4 and the castle after that, but then find the third act on the island to be kind of a letdown in comparison to the rest of the game. Now, full transparency here, I personally like the island section of Resident Evil 4, both in the original and the remake. I agree that it's the weakest act, but I still enjoy the hell out of it. But still, so many people don't. And the same can definitely be said about Resident Evil 8 Village, where the game starts to lose itself a little bit near the end with Heisenberg's factory, or even in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, where you play as Mia, exploring the abandoned ship, or hell, even Resident Evil 2 with the sewer sequence, or Resident Evil 5 when... Okay, I'm starting to feel bad only using Resident Evil games as examples. Dead Space does it too. The third quarter of that game feels bloated at times, and I feel like Alan Wake 2 could have had an hour or two shaved off of it. But anyway, I think you get my point. Most survival horror games, in my experience, have that part of the game that either due to level design or pacing or some other reason are viewed as the weak link of the whole game's connective tissue. But for me, in my opinion, Silent Hill 2 Remake does not have that pretty much at all. The game is an absolute masterclass of pacing and level design. Each new place you visit or old place you revisit builds upon what will come after and what came before in such a rare way that I don't often see in video games, and I only rarely see in some of the most skillfully written films and books. And let me explain what I mean in a little more detail by kind of going through the first few sections of the game. When the game opens up and you walk through the parking lot, then through the woods, all the way to the graveyard, then the graveyard into the town for the first time, you're quickly introduced to a lot of the core elements that make the game great. The town is creepy and spooky as hell. Exploring it evokes a sense of mystery and fear as you start to come across the lying figure figures for the first time, the first enemies you're introduced to in Silent Hill 2. You check out the first few buildings like the bar, the laundromat, the Saul Street apartments, just to name a few. The eeriness is on point. The sound design is on point. The combat mechanics that you're introduced to are on point for this specific game and this specific franchise. It's just a really great introduction to the game, but it does not represent the game as a whole. Overall, I was in love. Very, very much in love. But I'd be lying if I said there weren't some aspects with the game that I was disappointed with at first. It wasn't necessarily that scary right off the bat. Walking around the town and seeing the creatures was atmospheric as hell, but I wouldn't say it was scary. Yes, the town is shrouded in fog, but overall it's pretty bright out. The oppressive feeling hasn't fully kicked in yet. The monsters are horrifying looking for sure, but it's not difficult to just avoid them and run in the opposite direction if they try to approach you or attack you. So I wasn't scared to hear my radio go off. I wasn't scared to see them appear through the fog and again just start walking in my direction. And I certainly wasn't that afraid of dying in the early parts of the game either. You get a lot of health to start, more than you'll really know what to do with, and they're overall pretty easy to kill. But little did I know, this was just the game's first successful attempt at giving the player a false sense of security. The illusion that we got this figured out, that we have our radio turned on, we have our plank of wood in our hands. I've played Dark Souls before. I know how to dodge enemies. But then you enter the first actual legit named area of the game, the apartments, the Woodside and the Blue Creek apartment buildings to be exact. And the game just reveals so much more of itself to you, where before it was just flirting, now it's just straight up in your DMs harassing you, reminding you that you're not shit, and the tension and the fear factor pick up in a big bad way. I absolutely love the apartment buildings in Silent Hill 2, both in the original and in the remake. It's arguably my favorite main location in any survival horror game, definitely in my top 3 at least, and I know that could be weird to a lot of people. I know it's not some elaborate mansion in the woods or a castle or some hellish factory or a planet cracker spaceship. It's just an apartment building, just an average regular apartment building, and it definitely looks and feels like one in terms of its basic map design, but that's what I love about it, and that's something that I think the Silent Hill franchise does so incredibly well. It takes everyday locations that anyone can relate to and turns them into some of the best horror landscapes. Again, I love Resident Evil, and I'm not hating on it, not at all, but how often does the average person drive by or visit a giant creepy castle or a mansion or a prison on an island somewhere in the Atlantic? Not often, right? But I can practically guarantee every single person watching this has either lived in, visited, or driven by normal looking apartment buildings so many times in their lives. And ever since I played the original Silent Hill 2 game when I was a kid, it's transformed so many real world locations around me into potential Silent Hill locations. And I know that probably sounds stupid, but it's true. Now when I see an apartment building, especially when they're made out of brick, I often think to myself, if this town suddenly became Silent Hill, I bet I'd have to work my way through there. I bet Pyramid Head is in there right now being creepy as hell. But anyway, sorry for getting lost there for a moment, but the overall point I was trying to make is that Silent Hill is the horror franchise that makes the horror itself the most relatable, in my opinion. Yes, with the characters and the themes and the stories as well, 100%, but mainly with the locations, and the apartment is a perfect example of that. But yeah, you go through the town and then you make it to the apartments, and again, this is the first traditional survival horror location of the game, where you'll be finding keys and solving puzzles and finding a way out of the shithole that you just chose to enter. And like I said, I was kind of disappointed that the game wasn't that scary in the opening, but it gets so much scarier once you get inside, not only because it's dark and claustrophobic, but the sound design changes up, the soundtrack changes up, and you're introduced to the game's second monster, the mannequins. The goddamn mannequins, those things are freaky as hell. The scariest enemy in the game for me, no doubt. Their design is the most unsettling in my opinion, and the way they just move is just, it's disturbing as hell. First off, they don't alert your radio unless they're moving, so that's horrifying itself. It gives them so many opportunities to just jump scare you, which this game doesn't do often, by the way. It doesn't rely at jump scares at all, so when they do happen, they're actually really effective. But what's even more disturbing is when they try to run and hide from you. You could see one, then it'll just fuck off out of the room and start hiding somewhere else, and that turns you into the hunter as you start looking for it. And each and every time that happens, it got my heart thumping practically out of my chest, because they could be practically hiding anywhere. Again, under desks, in corners, under beds, and if they're not moving, there's no static, like I said, so you don't even get a sound advantage. And of course, they're more difficult to kill and more aggressive than the lying figures, so you're not only introduced to a brand new location that completely changes up the tone and the atmosphere, but combat starts to become more difficult as well, and all of those med drinks you've been stacking up start to dwindle more and more. Then after you make your way through the Woodside apartments, you get to the Blue Creek apartments, and I love what Bloober Team has done with this section of the game. I always loved the Blue Creek apartments in the original as well, but if I'm remembering correctly, it always kind of felt like Woodside Part 2 as opposed to its own unique thing. But in this remake, the Blue Creek apartments just double down on what I said about Woodside, about how the game is just paced to perfection and how it keeps revealing layers in a way that makes the game never feel stale or boring, or like you're doing the same thing for too long at any given point. When you cross over into Blue Creek, it's also the game's first time inviting you into the other world, where the enemies are harder and the world is even more twisted looking. Instead of everything looking creepy in a realistic way, now everything looks horrifying in a hellish way. Walls are replaced with rusty chain link. Regular doors now look like bolted hunks of metal. The enemies are even harder and way more plentiful. It's just amazing. And I think the art design for the other world in the remake is actually way better than how it was designed in the original. It looks more in line with the other Silent Hill games like Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 3. But then you finish up the apartments and you go back out into the actual town of Silent Hill. And where we were first introduced to the horror, it now feels like a breath of fresh air. After what we just endured in the apartments, in some weird way, walking the streets of Silent Hill is like a relaxing time out. But again, it isn't just the town part 2, where we start doing all the same stuff over again that we did the first time. You're on the other side of town, which means new buildings and new streets to explore. And it's here where the story also starts to pick up in a big way. Not that it was weak before, not at all, but it's when a lot of the narrative threads start to really come to the forefront. We meet Maria for the first time, one of the most memorable characters in any horror game ever. We get to spend more time with Eddie and Laura as well. And one of the last things we do in the apartments before we leave is get one of the most iconic moments with Angela.
Me. You. We're all the same.
I'm not like you.
Are you afraid?
And I'm not brushing over all this, by the way. I'm going to go more in depth about the story and the characters later, but after we spend a couple more hours of gameplay in the town, right when it could start to feel like it was overstaying its welcome, we go to the hospital. And I don't want to start sounding like a broken record here, but everything I said about visiting the apartments for the first time can also be said here, but not in a copy and paste, let's do the same thing again sort of way, but in a way that shows that the developers of the original and of this remake really knew how to keep the player engaged. and on their toes, and show them that you can't get too comfortable for too long. When you go to the hospital, you meet the bobblehead nurses for the first time, who are definitely the most difficult enemies we've met up until that point, and not to mention, along with Pyramid Head, they are the most iconic enemies in the whole franchise for sure, so just seeing them recreated in a modern video game is wild. But when you get to the hospital is when the game really doubles down on psychological horror. Obviously, the game from the very beginning is a psychological horror, but it's when you get to the hospital that shit starts getting really, really weird, and that's saying a lot. And a lot of the character moments in the hospital, again with Laura and especially with Maria, is when the game really proves that it's one of the best character studies in video games. And the whole game is once again a masterclass when it comes to the visual storytelling as well, and having the player try to unravel a mystery themselves by picking up and reading notes and letters and all the insane visual cues that litter the world of Silent Hill 2. And I think all of those aspects may be showcased the best in the hospital. Telling a story through notes and memos and artifacts is something almost every survival horror game does, but I think this is one of the best in terms of its execution, that along with the original Resident Evil and Resident Evil Remake. And when you leave the hospital, you're hit with the biggest emotional gut punch that the game has given us thus far, and it adds a great sense of sadness to an already oppressive feeling game, and I just absolutely love it. Then when you go back out to the town for the third time, it's the otherworld version of the town, and every enemy we've met so far is just littering the streets. The lying figures from the opening sequence, the mannequins from the apartments, and the nurses from the hospital. And that's another thing I love about this game and how it ties in to the overall themes, how these new monsters are introduced to James at each new location, but they don't just stay there. Once he meets them for the first time, they're there to stay, and they stalk him everywhere he goes. And there's so much more after that point of the game as well, like the prison. My god, the scariest part of the game for me, no doubt. But anyways, I think you get my point by now. I truly think the Silent Hill 2 remake is an S-tier game when it comes to its pacing and how the narrative and the world and the gameplay keeps changing up to always keep things fresh, to always keep us on our toes. It really, in my opinion, never really has that slog moment, that moment of the game, that section of the game that brings the whole experience down, at least a little bit. But now I want to talk about the characters and the story in more detail.
What?
James?
Now, I'm not going to do a wicked deep dive into the story, the narrative, and the themes or anything like that. There's a ton of videos on YouTube that go over that stuff and a bunch of stuff online in great detail. And who knows, maybe one day I'll do my version of that. But for right now, I just want to ramble a little bit about how much I love this story and these characters and the overall world of Silent Hill. Obviously, I've said this before a million times in so many of my previous videos, and so have so many other people, but it's worth mentioning again here. I was worried about how Bloober Team would handle these characters, this tone, and the themes of Silent Hill 2. In a lot of their other games, the way they portray certain topics is vastly different from how it should be done in Silent Hill, and a lot of people wondered if they'd be able to pivot in such a drastic way, and a lot of the early trailers we saw raised a lot of red flags. James was way too emotional, and if he came across that way in the full release like an emotional wreck, the game wouldn't have had the same impact. The tone would have been way off, the themes would have been completely ruined, and it would have been heartbreaking to me and to everyone else who values that original game so much. But I'm so thankful, and I'm insanely impressed that Bloober Team and everyone involved managed to recapture that lightning in a bottle for a second time in almost every way. The soundtrack is great. The art design is exactly what I always imagined a modern day Silent Hill game to look like. I was turned off a little bit at first by the slightly stylized look, but you go blind to it after spending more than 5 minutes in the game, if I'm being honest, and at times it even works to the game's benefit. And the performances from everyone, and I mean everyone, is done to damn near perfection. Everyone not only recaptures the iconic original performances, but adds to them in ways that make sense, and in other ways that may even be better. Luke Roberts brings so much to James. I know I said this in my original review, but I'll be damned if I don't say it again here. He's not too emotional, he's not too human, his performance is the exact right amount of dreamlike weirdness and uncanny valley, and when the emotions do start picking up as the story progresses and he shows more genuine human emotion, it's just enough to feel earned and believable, but not too much to the point where the whole illusion gets shattered and the suspension of disbelief is gone. And the same goes for everyone else. Angela is as good, if not better, than what I wanted her to be. Maria is the perfect balance of the real and the unreal, and if her performance wasn't up to standards, the scales would have tipped in an unfortunate way. Luckily, that was not the case. Eddie is great as well, an amazing recreation. I could go on, but I won't. I'm just insanely happy with how the character work and the performances in this game turned out. It's so easy to get stuff like this wrong with a game that's as specific as Silent Hill 2, where every single thing matters, for a fan base that views every single thing under a microscope. I can't imagine the pressure that was being felt, but they pulled it off in a way that no one could have expected. And I said this in my original review, but I'm going to say it again here. There was a time in my life where I considered the original Silent Hill 2 game to be my favorite story ever told in any medium, books, movies, and video games. But since then, I've often wondered if that's really true, because it's been quite a long time since I actually played the original game. It's been a while since it's been fresh in my mind. But now that I've re-experienced it, I can confidently say, without a shadow of a doubt, that this is my favorite narrative in any video game. It checks the boxes of everything I personally look for in a story. Now, I don't want to say this part with full certainty, but there's a really good chance this may also be just my favorite horror story ever told either, and that includes any medium. I know I just went on and on about the pacing of the gameplay, but the narrative is one of the most well-paced for a game as well. Again, it's a problem with so many survival horror games that the narrative starts wicked strong, but then it takes quite a long time for anything to happen, for any meaningful progression. So there's often huge chunks of the game where you're at a story standstill with no important character development happening either. I'm gonna use Resident Evil as an example again. I know it sounds like I'm shitting on that franchise, but I swear I am not. It's my favorite video game franchise of all time, but most of those games don't have that great of character arcs. The characters change a lot between games for sure, but not so much during the games themselves. Like Leon in the original Resident Evil 4. He's the same dude from the moment he shows up in the Jeep to the moment he leaves on the jet ski. But here in Silent Hill 2, meaningful plot and character progression is dished out at such a satisfying pace, and it kept me engaged and hooked the entire way through. It felt like I was being told a story first and foremost, and it just so happened to be told to me through the lens of an amazing video game. And again, I'm not gonna go into all the symbolism and themes of Silent Hill 2 and all the psychological aspects about what's real and what's not and all the different theories that people have, but trust me, if you're a fan of this game and you haven't done so yet, do your own deep dive into the lore. You have to. As soon as this video finishes, it's a rabbit hole unlike any other. It's so fun learning about how every single enemy represents some sort of personal punishment for James, and how they are symbolized in the 9 red squares, and how each location has an important reason for being visited, and the personal stories of the whole supporting cast as well. It's just crazy how everything in this game matters. It makes everything feel like it has a purpose for being there, and it's one of the best aspects about the Silent Hill franchise in general. It's also great because of the way the world works and the way it's designed. It never feels limiting. It's like a loophole that fixes what might be flaws in a lot of other games, like how most games have invisible barriers and blocked off paths and parts of buildings that are completely inaccessible, and those things constantly remind you that you are in fact playing a video game. And Silent Hill 2 has all of those aspects as well, but it feels like it's on purpose, that it's the way it's supposed to be. The town doesn't want you to go down that road. The town has no reason for you entering that room. But another reason why I think Silent Hill 2 Remake is practically a perfect survival horror game is because of how standard it is, and I don't mean that as an insult. In terms of gameplay, it has all of the traditional ingredients that you would expect from this genre. A creepy setting, scary monsters, melee and gun combat, puzzles, and open feeling exploration in an otherwise mostly linear game, but it doesn't have any additional features that could be make or break for a lot of players, especially players that are new to this genre. For example, Alan Wake 2 is a fantastic survival horror game, one of the best ever, especially in recent years, but it has a barrier of entry to a lot of people. I know a good handful of people didn't play that game because it was a sequel, and they didn't want to play the original for whatever reason. And I know some people did try to play, but the narrative was so outlandish that it just didn't vibe with them. Or Resident Evil 2 Remake, again, a fantastic survival horror game, but I know of so many people who loved it until Mr. X shows up, and he's constantly stalking you, and he's constantly on your ass, and they didn't like that aspect of the game so much that they stopped playing. Or even Callisto Protocol or something, a game that I liked more than most people, but still, I acknowledge it's far from reaching the heights of its peers. A lot of people, though, liked the setting and the story, but stopped playing because of the horribly repetitive gameplay. But Silent Hill 2, in my opinion, doesn't suffer from any of that. It's just a standard survival horror experience without any gameplay frills or innovations that could end up being barriers of entry. And I know that may come across like an insult or a negative, or to say the game is basic and boring, but it really isn't. The phrase, sometimes the simpler, the better, is 100% true. But yeah, that's my thoughts after playing the Silent Hill 2 Remake, and just some of the reasons why I think that this can be considered a perfect survival horror game. Is it a perfect game technically? No, it does have some flaws, but what I mean by a perfect game is that it sets the standard, it sets the bar. Every survival horror game that I play going forward is going to be compared to this one, and that's what I mean by Perfect. Again, if you liked this video, you should check out my first impressions review. There's a lot of details about the game that I didn't talk about here that I do talk about there. But anyway, have you played the Silent Hill 2 remake? If you have, let me know what you're thinking about it in the comments down below, because I'm curious. I know a lot of people are loving it, but I want to know why you're loving it. What are some of your favorite aspects of the game? And if you're disliking the game, let me know why, because I'm curious. I genuinely want to know. I'm open to these discussions. Once again, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and thank you for watching, especially if you watched this far.
Ugh!